Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Alec McCutcheon from Unicom. We're delighted to be hosting this Agile Business Conference webinar. Our presenter today is James Yoxall from IndigoBlue. James may be familiar to many of you. He's a very well-known consultant in Agile in Europe and worked with many household name companies. James will also be represented at the Agile Business Conference, which this year is on the 9th and 10th of October. The website's agileconference.org. The title today of the webinar is Agile Regain Control. So what I'll do now is hand over to James. Thank you.
Hello everyone. All right, the format for today is to present for about 25 minutes on governance and regaining control of Agile projects. And then we'll move into a Q&A session. And I have a colleague here who's going to be helping me with the Q&A, reading out the questions as they come through. So with no further ado, I'm going to switch over to the presentation. In last year's webinar, also related to the Agile Business Conference, I looked at Agile from the perspective of senior stakeholders, and in particular the fact that they feel a general lack of control with Agile projects. Last year I discussed why this problem existed, but there wasn't time to talk in detail about how to solve it. So I thought that this year I'd provide a more detailed look inside IndigoBlue's governance framework and how it enables stakeholders to regain a sense of control. In the time available, there's really only an opportunity to throw some ideas out there, not time to sort of properly justify them. And I appreciate that this will probably lead to more questions and answers, but my primary aim is to provide food for thought. So my first slide kind of summarizes the statement of the problem that we talked about last year, and this is based upon our experience of going around many organizations and getting feedback about many different kinds of problems. And I guess a summary of the essence of why this problem occurs is that Agile, very broadly speaking, concentrates at the detailed level. So it's focused on providing developers things that they can develop. Effective governance, however, operates mainly at the big picture level. So to achieve effective governance, you need to have a big picture and you need to be able to relate that through to the detail. So having set that very, very broad scene, the next step is to introduce IndigoBlue's model of what Agile is fundamentally about, because this underpins quite a lot of our thinking. So there are three key things that are fundamental to Agile, and they're all related to governance in one way or another. So one is that Agile is fundamentally about collaboration, and you can think of the alternative to collaboration as delegation. So in collaboration, we're all working collectively together towards the same goals. In a delegation model, something is handed over to a specific group of people with controls around that delegation. And one way of thinking about governance is that it is actually about dealing with acts of delegation from very senior stakeholders through to the project itself. So while you can be highly collaborative within the project, there is typically an active delegation around the project. And you don't always have that. Sometimes with lean startups and IT startups, there isn't a direct active delegation and everyone really is collaborating together, but the normal model is that there is some form of delegation. The second thing that's fundamental about Agile is that there is an incremental delivery plan. So we're thinking of the work as a flow of very small batches that achieve value rather than a more typical waterfall approach where you've got one large batch, which is the entire project. And the final thing is that we approach uncertainty resolution in a different way. So traditionally, we would resolve it all up front. Extreme forms of Agile, we might automatically leave everything until we get there. But the general case is that we need to think about the uncertainty we have, and we have to understand how to optimize the resolution of that. And the really important point is that these last two things, the incremental piece and the optimized uncertainty resolution piece, are fundamental to governance itself. the governance stakeholders absolutely have to be involved in understanding what the increments are going to be, what the value derived from those increments are going to be, and they have to accept the fact that there will be uncertainty and own that. There are ways and means of dealing with what happens when your senior stakeholders don't buy into that, which we'll cover briefly when we get to the appropriate sections. So, the IndigoBlue governance framework model consists of some core modules. So the actual governance structure itself, planning, forecasting, reporting, and baseline and change management. Those are absolutely mandatory and essential. There are some additional modules. So commitment management. So the general idea here is that you can plan a project where you share risk and various other things, contingency, or you can layer something on top of that that gives you the ability to provide commitment as well. So that's why we pull it out as a separate thing. And then there's another module around value management. So incremental delivery is all about value. So how do you actually go about measuring and managing value? So I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about all of those various modules. Just for completeness, there's a couple of upcoming modules. I'm not planning to talk about them in detail today, but one is around gating and assurance, and the other is how you deal with multiple portfolios of multiple projects. So that's the kind of breadth and extent of how we think about governance. So first of all, structure. So to start off with, there's nothing particularly unusual or profound. There's typically a sponsor and there's typically a project board. These are very old ideas and they work very well in lots of circumstances. The point where we introduce something new is the concept of having three distinct roles that champion specific elements of the delivery. And the ideal is that we have them in some sort of tension, and that tension is positive when you put all things together. So no one of them should be too much stronger than the others. So the first champion is the person responsible for delivery. That's typically a short-term focus, and that is typically a project manager. The second champion is responsible for the functionality. So that's kind of typically a product owner role. And you can see that if you only have a single product owner who's responsible for both delivery and functionality, they're wearing two hats, and there's sort of interesting opportunity for things to go wrong. So the functional champion is the person who is trying to maximize the value given the budget and constraints and available effort. And the third champion is responsible for the long-term cost of change of the technical solution. So that might be an architect or it might be a technical lead. And the idea is that all three of those champions report directly into the project board. They do not all get funneled through one person. The delivery person might be the person who kind of produces reports, and but the project board ought to be able to get direct information from each of those champions independently. Other things that are worth mentioning in passing is where there's significant compliance, then part of the governance structure is to think about how those compliances are going to be addressed and who owns them and what the mechanisms are. And those compliances might be external regulatory ones, financial, pharmaceutical, whatever, but they also might be internal ones in terms of, for example, architectural compliance or budgetary compliance or whatever. So that would be part of the governance structure. And the point that I made earlier is that we are talking about formal boundaries of delegation when we're talking about governance. And so when we're thinking about the structure, we should be identifying that, and examples of those might be contractual boundaries, different organizations that are collaborating together to deliver the same project. And some of the things you might want to think about is whether or not we are so collaborational, that we want to expose all the inner workings of the project to all parties concerned, or whether there are boundaries where we only want to expose certain kinds of information. And again, there'll be examples of what I mean by that coming up. So getting into the detail now, planning is the essential governance baseline for a project. So exactly what do we mean by planning in an Agile project? So the first key point is that the product backlog is a plan. It kind of seems a bit self-evident, possibly, but quite often there's a bit of debate about this when we go into organizations. The key thing is that if you think about a product backlog and you add, it's got estimates on it, if you add a start date and velocity profile of some sort to it, then it is possible to automatically calculate delivery dates for all the stories on the plan. Yeah, so you can almost think about a product backlog as directly transferable into a Gantt chart, or at least into a schedule. Sitting behind it, it's only one resource, which is the entire team, so it's a very simple kind of Gantt chart, but there is a direct correlation. The next important point is that the product backlog is not necessarily the whole plan, because the product backlog focuses on the solution that you're going to build. It doesn't, for example, cover where you're going to do the design work. So one of the points that we made at the beginning is that a key part of Agile is about uncertainty resolution. And one of the ways of dealing with uncertainty is design work. And it may be possible that your project can just deal with it as it comes along on a story-by-story basis. But it is quite important in the general case to think up front about specific uncertainties that you have, what the best way of dealing with them, what the impact of leaving them till late is going to be. And the output of all that is a design plan. And some projects involve more design work than build work, for example. So the design plan is quite important. And then the actual build piece itself might be only part of a much larger overarching plan that might include things like rollout or training schedules or all sorts of other things. And there's no particular reason why that overarching plan might not be much more amenable to more traditional project planning techniques where you have lots of logistical planning and stuff like that. So it's a mistake to potentially assume that the product backlog is everything and then start putting all sorts of weird and wonderful things on the product backlog. It really is about the work to build the solution. So the next point is that the plan should be a baseline. Because if it's a baseline, then you can start doing exception-based reporting. An exception-based reporting where you agree something up front and then only have to inform a widely dispersed set of stakeholders about substantive changes to that baseline is a very efficient way of managing a wide set of stakeholders that aren't plugged into things on a day-to-day basis. So the critical things about establishing a baseline are, first of all, is to only include things in that baseline that you actually want to report changes to. So one of the problems with waterfall projects is they create baselines that have all the detail in them. So you find yourself spending a lot of time doing change management at a very detailed level. So if we establish our baselines at the right level of description, of granularity, then we minimize the overhead of maintaining it. And the other key thing is that, again, to act as a baseline, the product backlog should be complete. Now, this is another area where we have quite a bit of debate with people used to processes such as Scrum. So yes, there are circumstances where you can get away without a complete product backlog, but those are ones in which you're not reporting against or forecasting against specific milestones and deliverables. If you are, then it is necessary to have points on the product backlog for all the work that you plan to do. So that doesn't mean to say that every single thing on the product backlog has to be at the same level of granularity. You can have some quite large stuff there, some contingent stuff, lots of uncertainty for things that are further downstream. It just requires that there is a baseline that you can do change management against when you start refining the detail later on. So still on planning, the next thing is that the product backlog with stories on it, okay, some of those stories can be quite large, but we said at the beginning that we want to create a big picture view, not the detailed story view. So one of the things that we do to create that big picture view is to identify things that we call functional milestones. So a functional milestone is basically a line through the product backlog. And it's something that you achieve. It's a significant achievement. Right? It's not the same as an epic, because you might complete a proportion of several epics and then return to lower priority parts of those epics. Right? So you can't actually put a line through the product backlog where you say this epic is completed. In the general case, sometimes you can, but in the general case you can't. A functional milestone is the point where something significant has been completed. And it might, for example, be where a level of risk has been resolved. A key milestone for pretty well every project is where you reach the point where the investment has been worth it. Reluctantly, maybe, but still, you would have done the same thing again, even if you knew you would only deliver that much functionality. There's a line through the product backlog, which is a milestone. The other thing about those milestones is that if you put those milestones together, they make up a high-level plan. So you can actually start reporting against that high-level plan to senior stakeholders. And that plan is what we call the incremental delivery strategy. So it identifies the key increments that, from a governance level, the stakeholders are interested in. Moving on, whistling through all these topics, the final bit on the planning side is to use the technique of capacity management and to use this at the governance level. And what we mean by capacity management is not just viewing the team as having a single capacity, which is, in points terms might be 100 points a sprint, but to hold back some of those points and assign different owners to them. So the product owner in the classic Scrum sense would own one bucket of points, so that might be 80 or 90 out of the 100 total that you have available, but you can hold back other points for other purposes, such as technical debt or current system support or demand that comes through that just has to be done, you don't have any choice about it, whatever it might be. And we don't just use it for planning purposes and forecasting purposes, but also for metrics, so that we can see the reason that we're not progressing fast enough is because there's more work required to do current system support than was originally planned, for example. This same technique is quite useful when we come to portfolio management, where we actually can have multiple owners for the same team and potentially multiple product backlogs and all that kind of stuff. So it's a sort of a first step on a wider journey. So at this point, we've got a plan, a baseline plan. The next thing we want to do is to use that for reporting. And a couple of key things about reporting. First of all, I would assert that reporting is in general not particularly useful without forecasting. And that's a sort of debatable statement, but one of the common patterns that one sees is reporting that just says, we have done these things, we've done X, Y, and Z. And what that does is leave the interpretation of whether or not doing X, Y, and Z is a good thing or a bad thing, or is creating a problem or not creating a problem, to the person who's receiving the information. Now, so a key principle is that it should be the responsibility of the supplier of the project to report in terms that are easily understood by the recipients. And if you're doing exception-based reporting, then the key ways of doing that are doing your reporting at the big picture level, not at the detailed level, doing your reporting in terms of exceptions to the baseline that is already understood, and you can do that at a very high level in terms of red, amber, green statuses and standard techniques like that. So in order to do that, you have to take the actuals, things that have really happened on the project, and extrapolate those across the project as a whole. And what's interesting about that then is that you end up with outputs of the reporting process, such as red, amber, green, against cost, schedule, risk, and standard things like that, that can be completely consistent across multiple projects that are being run using different methodologies. Agile here, waterfall here, it doesn't matter. At the portfolio level, it all ends up being roughly the same thing. What is important, though, then, is that where there are problems or a desire to validate that the information that's flowing through is valid, that it should be possible to dig into the forecasting process, and in order to do that, the forecasting should be structured, repeatable, and then ultimately auditable. So that means that there needs to be standardized answers to all sorts of questions such as, how do you extrapolate from the velocity you've achieved to how many points you're going to deliver across the whole project, and whether or not that's causing risk to your baseline or not. And I'm not going to go into that level of detail here, but broadly speaking, it's pretty straightforward. In one sense, you've got the velocity that you've achieved, you multiply that up by the number of sprints. But in reality, there's all sorts of quirky little details that come out of that. And so, the headline message is that whatever you do, it should be consistent and well-defined and repeatable. So moving on then, we've got a baseline. We're doing exception reporting against that baseline. Therefore, that automatically brings you into the subject of managing those baselines. And the key mechanism for managing those baselines is change management. Now, change management in an agile context is quite often met with horror and with ghast looks. I think the important point about change management is that it doesn't have to be a significant overhead. And the main reason for that is that you can do different forms of change management at different levels. So the first thing you have to do is decide what constitutes your baseline. And at the project board level, at the highest level of reporting, and at a level that requires formal agreement from the project board to change it, there are some key things. And they will be the total number of points that you're going to deliver. So it's a baseline. We've said we're going to deliver 1,000 points. If we are making progress, it says we're only going to deliver 900, or the project board comes up with a whole bunch of new stuff that means it's going to be 1,100. Both of those things require formal change control to re-baseline the project. Similarly, the number of sprints. So we're going to achieve those 1,000 points in 10 sprints rather than 15 sprints. Changing the number of sprints is a formal change control. A couple of other things then you can factor into the baseline at the highest level. One is the solution vision. So we're going to, at a very high level, the way that we're going to achieve our business aims is through a solution that, broadly speaking, goes in this direction. And if you wanted to change that, because that should be very stable. If you wanted to change that, then that requires formal change control. And one of the other things then is that if you're doing value modeling, then there are elements of the value proposition which you can bring into the baseline. So it's not just the solution, but what it is that we expect that solution to achieve. Now, there's some interesting challenges around that, because you don't necessarily have the authority and control within the project to deliver the value, but sometimes you do, and sometimes you can set it up so that you do, so that you can think about incorporating value into your baseline. Below that, there are elements of the baseline that don't require, these are at the detailed level, and they don't require formal project board decision-making to change them. So this is the normal stuff that we expect to be able to change on a daily basis within an Agile project. So exactly what the stories are, and exactly the breakdown of stories, and we take big stories and make them smaller, and we change the priorities, and we do all of this kind of stuff. And indeed, on a per story basis, we can do things like, when we've refined it, we can say it's no longer 10 points, it's 20 points. We can do that kind of stuff, but we have to do it in a controlled way. So what we should have is some sort of audit trail, and where a set of changes aggregate into something which is significant at a higher level. So if we change the number of points from 10 points to 20 points and we don't have anywhere for them to come from, then we've ultimately changed the number of points in the project as a whole. Then that goes up to the project level control, the project board level. So we need to have, if we're going to have baselines, we need to have some sort of baseline management, but exactly what goes into that baseline is quite significant, and what level of change control will make a big difference on the overheads. So we're running out of time here. So that was the core stuff. The last two headline things were about commitment management and value management. So as I said in the intro, it's possible to create a plan to do something, but to then lay a commitment on top of that requires something else. And that something else is fundamentally comes down to contingency. So you need to consider who's owning risk and uncertainty. So sometimes people will say, what we want you to do is to make a commitment where you own all the uncertainty. I don't want to know about that uncertainty. And one of the ways to deal with that, one of the significant ways to deal with that, is to add appropriate contingency in to be able to take on board those things that aren't known. Now, one of the key things to say about commitment management and contingency management is that Agile naturally tends to remove contingency. We do a lot of work with teams where they're following the standard Agile process. They're doing best endeavor estimates. They're doing yesterday's weather forecasting of what it is that they're going to achieve per sprint. They're doing all the standard things that XP and Scrum say you should do. And they're getting beaten up over it. And the reason they're getting beaten up is because actually there's a boundary between the people that can accommodate natural variance in what happens in a sprint and external boundaries of other organizations or whatever that can't accommodate that. And there's no contingency built in, and there's no separation of the reporting at different levels. So these teams are sort of generally under the cosh because any sprint that delivers less than they thought that it might is suddenly turned into a bad mark. And in the end, what they start doing is building back in their own contingency on a per sprint basis, which actually reduces the overall efficiency. So there's a number of contingency options that can be used, tools that can be used. There's what we call functional contingency, which is stories you've got on the product backlog that can be de-scoped. You can do that across the project as a whole, or you can do it on a per sprint basis. So DSDM, for example, is quite makes use of having contingent stories, functional contingency on a per sprint basis. So you would expect each sprint to not overrun. But you can actually do the same thing as a project as a whole, where you are always doing the highest priority work and not implementing low priority stuff first. But that's one kind of contingency. There's another simple kind of contingency where you plan that you need 1,000 points, so you actually contingently plan for 1,200 points. You can put contingency on your velocity, so you calibrate. You think you're going to be doing 100 points a sprint, so you assume that you're only going to do 80 points a sprint. All of these techniques can be used, and then once you've set that up, you then have to think about your reporting as to how much of the contingent stuff you hide. So you don't want to necessarily expose all the inner workings. You don't necessarily want to report achieved velocity in a way that kind of automatically hands all that contingency back to other people. So that's commitment, and then the very final slide is about value management. And what we're just fundamentally saying here is that a project builds a solution, but ultimately its objective is to deliver value. Incremental delivery requires a very deep understanding of value because you want to deliver value early, and sometimes you have to search quite hard to understand what that value might be. Uncertainty as well tends to increase as you go down to the more detailed solution. You're making more assumptions that the solution itself will deliver the intended value. So in a situation where there's lots of uncertainty, if you go higher up the value chain, you can typically find areas where there's much more stability as a mechanism for governing your project. What we find in general is that it is very important and useful to be explicit about the relationships between your objectives and your solutions. Basically in terms of a lot of the high-level decisions you're making about prioritization, about pivoting, which for people that are familiar with the lean startup is, you've got experiments, you have a direction. Those experiments might support the fact that you continue going in the direction that you're going in, or they might require you to rethink and pivot and move in a different direction. And just bringing it all the way back to one of the early statements at the beginning, it's all about the big picture, and value management is a fundamental way of being able to talk big picture to certain stakeholders and detailed solution at various other points. So that was the presentation element. And bringing the camera back. And question time.
Okay, thank you, James. So I have the questions lined up. The first question was actually, will these slides be available following the presentation? And I think the answer to that is yes, I can answer that. And also it will be available online as a video. So the second question was, at the outset, James, you talked about the essence of Agile in IndigoBlue's terms of collaboration, incremental delivery, and uncertainty management. How do these map onto the Agile manifesto?
Actually, that's pretty straightforward. Two of the principles in the Agile manifesto are directly related to collaboration. So individuals and interactions over processes and tools, that is fundamentally a statement saying the team should be more collaborative, and engagement with collaboration with customers, open negotiation, again, that's about collaborating in the wider sense. The other two ones are quite interesting, though. Working software over documentation is basically another way of saying that you should be delivering incrementally. So working software, proper, complete software, is an increment. Producing documentation is not an increment. And similarly, the responding to change over creating a detailed plan is kind of another way of saying that a fundamental aspect of Agile is how you manage your uncertainty. We find our message is slightly more comprehensive and meaningful to people, and less confusing, but there is a direct one-to-one correspondence. One of the things I'd like to point out is that one of the problems that Agile has suffered from over the years is that the statements in the Agile manifesto that we don't value documentation and we don't value planning have led to all sorts of strange behaviors on projects. Planning is absolutely fundamentally important. It's a different kind of planning. It's a planning that is both incremental and that resolves uncertainty in a different kind of way.
Thank you. Another question here. Regarding planning, can you give an example of the product backlog being at the wrong level of granularity when establishing a baseline?
I don't think, right, the product backlog itself fulfills a purpose which is driving the work that you do from it. So it will have lots of small things on it. What we want to do to establish a baseline is first of all make it complete. And to do that, we should not be afraid to put some very large items on it with a large amount of uncertainty, with a large number of points. And that gives us a baseline so that when we get to refining and resolving those things, we have a starting point, a budget that we understand that if we blow that budget, then we are into a change situation. There is an impact of that. The other thing is that if you have lots of detail on a product backlog, lots of stories, you do a dozen, 15 stories per sprint, the thing you do not want to do is to be reporting to senior stakeholders, look, here's the 15 stories that we did. I mean, it's not necessarily wrong to do that, but the implication is that they have to then work out whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Very similarly, telling them that you've achieved a velocity of 100 is not necessarily meaningful to them. Maybe you say you achieved a velocity of 100 against a plan of 120 or a plan of 80, and it starts to get more meaningful, but you're still looking at, well, what's the impact of that on the forecast over the project as a whole? But so it's not having the wrong kind of stories on the product backlog, but if you have lots of detailed stories, you have to be able to collect them together into something which is at a level of granularity which you can report against to people that aren't interested in the detail. And that's where we collect together a bunch of stories into milestones.
Thank you. I have a very long question which I want to try and break down into a number of sections. And this comes from John Coleman. So John, apologies if I paraphrase a little too much here. Shouldn't a number of points be subject to change alerts as opposed to change control? I fear that teams wouldn't feel brave enough to push back on pushback from the project board, and quality might get cut off.
I think that's a very valid concern. The difference between change alert and change control is I absolutely do not, in using the term change control, in fact, okay, let me rewind a bit. I would like to call the whole subject baseline management and not to talk about change management or change control at all, because that's really what you're trying to do, is to understand the impact of things on your baselines. However, change management is something that people kind of understand, and to avoid getting into conversations about baseline management, don't you mean change management? Kind of included both. Change control is something that should only happen at a high level, at an aggregate level. Audit trails, that kind of stuff, which I guess is what you mean by change audit, change logging, is a very low ceremony way of demonstrating control. The wider question of if you're doing change management, some sort of budgetary management at a low level, and the impact that the attitudes of senior stakeholders are going to have on the team. Ultimately, if your senior stakeholders are operating in that kind of way, it is better to expose that behavior early on and directly deal with it than it is to kind of sweep it under the carpet and only realize there's a problem sometime downstream. So it's really about getting behaviors explicit and on the table by having well-defined processes rather than, I mean, yes.
I think you've already answered this question in your last response, James, but as an adjunct to that previous question, the comment is that baselining is flawed and represents a lack of mindset change in Agile.
Baselining is flawed. Baselining is a tool, and it's a tool that enables you to interact with a wide group of stakeholders without having to keep all stakeholders up to speed with every single detail of the project. It is a mechanism that allows you to operate at a higher level. Why does it represent a lack of mindset change? And it kind of depends what you define the important mindset changes to be. That's why I started the whole presentation with what we think the key mindset things are. So if the key mindset things are what I said, an incremental plan, dynamic uncertainty, optimized uncertainty resolution, then I don't see any way in which thinking about baselines is counterproductive to that. If you define Agile in other terms, which other people do, then yes, it can be a problem.
Thank you. Next question, by what mechanism do you get compliance stakeholders involved in assuring proper governance?
In a nutshell, we define very precisely the things that we need to be compliant with. And then we provide traceability through to the things that deliver those specific requirements. So that at the end of the project, for example, we can answer a question that says, where are the stories, or specifically where are the tests that demonstrate compliance with the requirement in the first place. So there's a degree of traceability. The problem traditionally is that traceability is done across everything. So you write a specification and someone reviews it to say whether or not they think it's compliant, and then you have to prove you've delivered everything that was in that specification. So that's pretty inefficient, but where compliance is fundamentally required, then we get the person who is defining the compliance requirements to be explicit about it and not just sign off a whole bunch of stuff. And what we also find is interesting about that is that those compliance requirements are often incremental in their own right, so particularly regulatory ones. There are those things that absolutely, definitely have to be done. There are those things that actually there's quite a bit of leeway. And there's also a huge amount of uncertainty. FSA regulations, it's an art rather than a skill to define exactly what you need to do to be compliant.
Thank you, James. Another question here regarding commitment management. Mike Cohen might suggest reserving a sprint in a release plan as the contingency approach. Can you compare the benefits of this approach against point and velocity contingency approaches?
That is a way. So that's just a specific instance of a wider set of solutions. So what you're in effect doing there is adding velocity contingency. So you've got the same number of points, but instead of doing them over 11 sprints, you're doing 10 sprints, you're doing them over 11 sprints. Yeah. So that's just a way of designing into your plan velocity contingency. But there are other ways. Yeah, that's the thing. Is that but they're kind of all much for muchness. But what happens if your contingency is not one sprint's worth, for example?
Okay. Another question. On our project, some of the tests put forward for the definition of done are sometimes unnecessary, which leads to a lot of wasted time. How do you manage this?
Oh gosh. There's quite a lot in there. So first of all, definition of done is there's a sort of part of the planning process which is how much work is outside of sprints versus inside of sprints, and the bottom line is we pay very close attention to our definition of done, and it is part of the upfront planning process and definition process. And if you've got the wrong definition of done, then yes, it will lead to inefficiency.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, James. Does this approach with governance help with agile contracts?
The baselining, change management, and contingency management processes we have used quite successfully to define all sorts of contracts, including fixed price contracts. Because fundamentally, with a fixed price contract, for example, it's what is the baseline that you are fixing, and the answers I gave earlier, such as what you are fixing is delivery of a specific number of points, is an interesting way of dividing up the ownership of different types of risk between the various parties. So in that model, the supplier still owns the risk that they can work as productively as they believe they can with the velocity, but the customer owns the number of any contingency in terms of whether or not the points that are identified will actually deliver the solution, or whether they go through feedback loops and refinement and ongoing uncertainty resolution, they will ultimately need more points, and they own that side of things. So in our experience, it works very well. Yes.
I think that's all we have time for now.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. We will, as James mentioned earlier, be making the recording available afterwards, so we'll send you a link and look forward, hopefully, to seeing you at the Agile Business Conference on the 9th and 10th of October. Thank you.